This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host Phil Goldberg, author. His latest book, The Life of Yogananda, out whenever you're listening to this, April 2018, but can pre-order it now on Amazon. And our guest today, back on the show, uh, the author of her latest book, Yoga and Psyche, Marianna Caplan. She is a psychotherapist, yoga teacher, and the author of 8 books. And the latest, as I said, Yoga and Psyche, integrating the paths of yoga and psychology for healing, transformation, and joy. Marianna, thank you so very much for coming back with us.
It's such a pleasure. I really appreciate what you guys do.
Thank you, Marianna, and it's great to have you back. And we want to encourage our listeners, if they're hearing this for the first time, to go listen to our first interview with Marianna, where she talks about her personal path a lot more than probably we will today. Tell us, because you have a new book out, Yoga and Psyche, tell us the origin of that book idea and why you wrote it.
Yeah. So the origins, in fact, are my whole adult life, and specifically in the sense that about 25 years ago I started both my yogic and my psychological journey, and in my experience, both diving deep into spiritual work, I would hit places that, although I had great teachers and great traditions, my experience as a Western person with a Western psychological makeup and the wounds that are quite specific to the Western psyche, the practices weren't penetrating those wounds and those needs of mine, not just for spiritual development, but for personal integration, for well-being, for happiness, for things that I valued. And simultaneously, I was raised in the psychological tradition, and for me, I see psychology as a tradition in the making. Right, yoga has its vast expanse of these 2,500 to 5,000 years, and psychology is this baby of 130 some years old that I think is developing quickly, efficiently, profoundly. And my personal and professional life have been a simultaneous process of these two paths. And about 12 years ago, I started teaching yoga and psyche in different forms, and teaching yoga teachers, yoga practitioners, psychologists, mental health workers, or just earnest people how to integrate these traditions, how to bring them together, whether it's in the therapy room or in the yoga room in your personal practice or teaching. And like books do, in my experience, and maybe your own, Phil, they insist themselves from the inside. So 6.5 years ago, it just started pushing from the inside, and I knew that feeling from my previous books, but at this time it was a little bit different because I had a 1.5-year-old baby that I was raising. So I had a little bit of a problem because I had a baby book that wanted to be born, and I had an actual baby. So I put out a simple call for help, not really expecting it to be responded to. I wrote to my email list saying, are there anyone who wants to help me research this book? I would theoretically like to mentor you, but I don't have any time. But I'm looking for help researching this book. And at that time, I got immediately over 20 highly qualified master's, doctoral students in psychology, yoga teachers. And basically, I heard my teacher on the inside. He had died at that point, and I heard him saying to me, "This is a good problem." I was reading over these CVs, and so I basically took them all. And from that, we were able to develop a much larger project. Mm-hmm. And there was a conference in 2014. There was academic research. Two of the doctoral students helped me research everything up to date in all related subjects and published that. We were able to research all the popular literature, and I had a whole team. So it was really a deep collaborative effort. It took a long time because I was raising this child who's now 7.5. And so finally, although I've been teaching this for 12 years, finally there's a book that really condenses it all.
Marianna, I'm curious. When you were 34 years old, you suffered from multiple autoimmune disorders, and you went into chronic fatigue, you had physical problems. And this is when after seeing multiple doctors, you turned to yoga. Was the yoga effective in helping you because you had a disorder that was in large part a mental, mind over matter kind of a thing? Or, but on the other hand, yoga obviously affects the mind, but it also affects the body. Or was it the yoga postures that strengthened the physical body yeah, and allowed you to heal? I assume it was a combination of both, but which had the more powerful impact from the yoga? Its effect on your psychology, or if its effect on your physical body?
Um, Quite honestly, as my understanding grows over time, the there the psycho and the somatic, right? They're so intimately intertwined, and obviously for me the misuse of it is when people take it to an extreme and say, you created your cancer or things like that. That pains me to no end. And at the same time, my own ailment was physical and it was psychological. I had all of these autoimmune disorders, and I was profoundly burnt out. I was living out of balance, even though it was in the name of spiritual service and work and practice. So I spent years and tens of thousands of dollars on all kinds of both Western and Eastern non-traditional medical approaches, and then I took on yoga in a much more serious way. I'd been practicing for years, but I went to do a teacher training, and the yogic principle of the inner healer or the inner physician, Jungli Kayamane and Ashtanga yoga that I was studying, I really took to that, and it wasn't just an asana study, right? So it was a full-on deep study of philosophy and pranayama, and I learned through yoga and then subsequently through my studies in trauma and somatics in a much deeper way to listen to, right? We all talk about listening to the body, right. And it's a real thing, and it's not always easy to do, but at that time I want to say I was afforded the time, but basically I had crashed my body so completely that I had nothing else that I could do except take the time to listen. And with the support of yoga and really unwinding, it was really honestly unwinding my physical body. It was the nourishment that the yoga provided. It was the instruction on balance and the perspective and a real overview, really rebalancing my whole energy, breathing. For me, 20 some years of yoga, probably the most profound effect is being able to breathe more fully, right? And in that breath has prana, and the prana has life force. So it was more healing than the, thousands of dollars of supplements that I was taking, and all the different kinds of treatment was my own breath when actually accessed and actually being willing to slow down, not because I wanted to, but because I had to, and taking in. That's how I see it in retrospect.
Interesting. Marianna, in your discussion of what brought you to be thinking in terms of the material in the current book, you mentioned noticing at some point psychological issues that you called unique to the Western psyche. I'm curious what that is and how Western life might or may not encourage certain conditions that others don't.
Yeah. And, Western, we have to use that broadly and loosely.
Yeah.
But yoga was formulated in India, and it was primarily transmitted by great Indian men. It's practiced by many women, but a lot of the transmitters have been great Indian and yogi men.
Right.
And yet, right here in the Western world, it's practiced primarily, right, some 90% by women. And I just went to India. I think it was my 16th visit. I spent a lot of time there, a lot of time studying and practicing and touring other people. And in all of these times, even as a psychologist, and I have many, many old friends in India, it's so apparent to me that the psyche, and right, the psyche is something very challenging to talk about, but I live kind of interacting with that day to day with my work as a clinician, and it's become tangible. It's not something I can see, but it's something I can perceive, and whatever that psyche is, it doesn't work the same way in India. I don't. All these years in India, many years ago, I understood that I just didn't understand. I respected, I appreciated, but that there was something different. And I think there's lots of different variables that account for that. But I mean, it's the things like soul, when we talk about these great things and consciousness, right? They're transcultural, and yoga is right a masterful path on this, and it's how it translates into right every country and culture and blends with different religions. It's so timeless. But then this psyche is much more personal and individual and multi-generational and unique. And in the Western world, we grow up differently.
Mm-hmm.
And nowadays, right, the family structure, the bonds or lack of bonds, right, our fragmentation, our speed, trauma, right, which is another big buzzword that I write about super in depth in the book, and not only the overt shock traumas, but the developmental traumas. And nowadays, the last couple of years of my private practice, before the elections, we had never talked about politics in psychotherapy. And people not only from the States, because I do Skype work, people from all over. We were talking a lot about politics. Last year there was these big fires in California. There's these ecological traumas, developmental traumas, and not only things that happened, but an area that I tend to have a affinity for, I think because it's not talked about as much, is things that didn't happen that we really wanted, whether they were developmental steps that we really wanted or aspects of life, a child, that we wanted, or a partner, things that people are really shaken and suffering about, things that didn't happen. And right, so there's so much in this category of trauma if we use it not loosely but broadly, which I think is actually applicable now. And I think that we just have different needs.
Marianna, I wanted to ask you.
And certainly women, right?
Yeah.
And women's bodies.
Yeah.
We have people
have different needs than an Indian man.
Yeah. We have people listening in, from all over the world to our podcast, and somebody's listening to this and they're thinking, I've experienced similar things physically that Marianna's experienced. I've seen doctors. I'm not getting help. I would like to then try yoga to see if that helps me. How do they find a yoga teacher that would be appropriate for them, number one? And number two, should they actually look for somebody like you, who's both a psychotherapist and a yoga teacher? And I would imagine, if you're in Los Angeles and New York, it's one thing, or San Francisco. If you're in many other parts of America or the world, it might be more difficult. So what would you recommend to them?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And even though we talked about how the yoga helped heal my illness, it wasn't that alone. Even though I had been a therapist for 10 years, I took on 3 years of postgraduate studies after the yoga training in trauma and somatics. And, if we summarize in a mini second what the somatic work is, it's taking psychotherapy from the inside out. It's really incorporating the body and its transformation, and listening to the body and working from the body, including the mind, in psychotherapy. So all of that's to say that I appreciate and agree that this is not going to be available all over the world. But I think that yoga in conjunction with psychotherapy is much more effective. Sometimes we can find somebody who contains both, but even in tandem, they're very powerful. And if I was going to look for, what kind in each, in terms of yoga, I would be looking for somebody highly experienced, right, in their years, somebody who at least offered an emotional depth context, right? You go into their room and it's not quite young goddess yoga or, straight alignment-based yoga. It's like somebody with a depth and breadth of practice in the yoga front, even if they're not psychologically trained, and somebody who you sense that there's space in their class for you to modify, for you to feel, right? If you pull back or you break out crying, it's not going to be a disturbance. If you do something differently because your body's telling you to do that, you're not going to be corrected for misalignment. So that would be but more than that, the first thing I said would be the depth of experience and being of the practitioner.
Along those lines, Marianna, these days, as you know, yoga is almost synonymous with asana practice, with postural yoga.
Right.
We know that yoga is more than that. In line with Dennis's question, what would you say to people who are not inclined to the kind of yoga classes that are so common now that are like 90% asana? Maybe they're older, maybe they have physical issues or just not inclined in that direction. How do they take advantage of this integral yoga and psyche? Are there other avenues?
Yeah, and I think that point should be brought up in every conversation of yoga. That even though I may assume when I think of yoga, right, I think of posture, I think of meditation, I think of breath, I think of study and ethics, and I do agree, Phil, right, that it's become almost synonymous with asana. But I've also noticed in the last 5 or 10 years that there's more depth offerings available.
Yeah.
I mean, this year alone, by Self Magazine, I was so touched. They interviewed me for an article on crying in yoga class, and another one on shavasana and the importance of it. So your point is to raise that they're actually they're not the majority of the option of what's put out, but there are. I think maybe not in all parts of the world, but of course there's online offerings that are really good now, that are accessible, and pranayama, right? Breath practices, powerful, life-changing. Meditation practices, they can be done at any age. And I was just mentoring somebody yesterday who's passionate about offering yoga for the elderly because right, yoga's being understood even scientifically is so beneficial. So my dad's a doctor, he's 86, he said you should start doing yoga, and right, but so many elderly people will hear that and say, I can't do that, right? And in fact, showing up in one of these yoga classes, even a beginning yoga class, may be too much. But we can show up and do pranayama, right, and breathing. We can do yoga nidra, which is right deep and meditative and can be done lying down. Once I had a student in the university, I was teaching a class, and he had this unique condition where his body would get overheated by doing almost anything. But he wanted to show up at the workshop, so he visualized the whole class that we did. And I was super interested because he got a tremendous amount of benefit just through visualizing the practice.
Interesting.
Yeah, Marianna,
and I'm going to wind back to one other element of Dennis's question, because I feel like I answered it incompletely. I said what I look for in a yoga teacher. But similarly, right, if we want to pursue these in tandem, which I personally feel is more powerful than either of them alone, the same is true of the therapist.
Yeah.
Of course, there's many therapists who are experienced, but it is my personal bias, not exclusively, but it is a bias that therapies that include a somatic or body-centered approach that have an understanding of trauma, I'm seeing, and it was true in my own experience and in others, that they're more effective because the limit and the frustration that many people find in therapy is that we can understand a whole lot about why we are the way we are, right? But nothing changes. We can explain it, but it's still there, and it's showing up in our patterns and our expressions. And that was how I got from my yoga training into the trauma training, because I could feel, they say the issue is in the tissue. I could feel my body, right, reenacting things that weren't serving me, even though I knew better, right? I had learned better. So approaches that at least include the body, include a perspective on trauma, I lean toward, right? So even if we're living somewhere in the world and we don't have all of these trauma-sensitive yoga and all these things, right? A really solid, experienced yoga teacher, who has a larger context of yoga than simple asana, not simple, but asana, right? And a psychotherapy that includes the body in some way or another. There you have a really powerful complementary treatment.
Good.
Marianna, one final question I had for you was, do you have many psychotherapists, psychiatrists, psychologists reaching out to you saying, hey, I don't know anything about yoga, but I think it might be a tool that I could help my patients with, or perhaps even myself as well. Do you have much of that, of those folks seeking you out?
Yeah, these are the amazing people who I'm so privileged to teach in my trainings. I show up and right, there's doctors and there's psychiatrists and there's mental health workers, there's experienced yoga teachers, but my trainings are always open to anyone, even if they're new to the practices, but that's a lot of what I'm training people to do, is to integrate the other modality into whatever, integrate the yoga into the psychology. And it doesn't have to be on any grand scale. It's not that every mental health worker has to go through their 500-hour teacher training. We can learn simple practices. They don't have to involve putting your patients on a yoga mat and doing postures, things with posture and with breath and even context and perspective that we gain from meditation. Very, very simple tools, right? Can kind of yogify the mental health context. And I think people have this idea, if they want to do that suddenly they're going to be doing yoga in their therapy room. And I had done that a lot in the past, but nowadays I actually find that the very simple practices. Often people come to therapy and they want to feel like it's therapy. They don't want to feel like it's a yoga class. So by simply bringing in basic and powerful practices and a deeper spiritual context into the therapy room, it opens up worlds, and it doesn't have to look that different. We don't have to worry about being some super alternative therapist. It can be very subtle and no less effective.
Marianna, as you pointed out, yoga, the tradition of yoga in all its multifaceted forms, is thousands of years old. Psychology is a baby, as you put it. That means that in the yoga world, over the course of centuries, there's a lot of what we would think of as empirical data, or firsthand experience, lab work, so to speak. You mentioned that a lot of your new book of yoga and psyche is research-based. What, if you could sort of summarize it, what is the status of research, hard empirical research on these areas now? We know that research on various yoga practices has been going on for 40 years now. What is new and what is exciting to you?
And let me just say one thing I have to throw out. We only have about 4 minutes left, so in the time that we have, yeah.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, I was just printing out some notes for a training I'm teaching on Saturday, so a lot of the research, it's consistently demonstrated. Yoga research has demonstrated yoga's positive impact on PTSD, right, or post-traumatic stress disorder, and all kinds of trauma, complex trauma, so forth, depression, anxiety, immunity, eating disorders, attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity, schizophrenia, well-being, and mood, for starters.
Wow.
Right? And there's all that I have. The published academic research is on my website, but it's integrated in a very user-friendly format into the book. But right, that's the beauty of science right now is it's science, right? It's demonstrating what the yogis have always known, but science is hard data, and it speaks to insurance companies, right? And it speaks to healthcare, and it's allowing yoga to become acceptable, not only right in like a daily modality, but in places where it can really matter, where people's practice of yoga can be funded, where insurance can begin to cover it, and that's only increasing. And I love what science is offering to yoga, even if it's only validating it, in a language that's accessible to a mainstream audience.
There may be more research on the yogic practices now than there are on psychotherapy, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
I think psychotherapy on its own hasn't done so well under research. I think with yoga, it will do much better. Marianna, thank you so very much for your time.
But check it out.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
A little note on that. The three big developments in psychotherapy that I go into the book is the somatics, the neuroscience, and then the trauma healing.
Very good.
Because research is being done on all of those, and then the research is panning out a lot more effectively.
Okay.
And we should say that your website is yogaandpsyche.com. And you started...
more about my clinical practices on my other website, realspirituality.com, that you can find each through the other.
That'll be on the site. And you also started something called Yoga and Psyche International that people can look up and find out about.
Yeah.
Right. And the
you
name
guys
of
are a powerful team.
Right. And the name of the book again.
Don't waste a moment.
Yeah. Yoga and Psyche, integrating the paths of yoga and psychology for healing, transformation, and joy. Marianna Caplan, and that's Caplan with a C, Caplan, and we'll have all that information posted up. Marianna, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on with us today.
My pleasure. Thank both of you. My thanks to both of you.
Take care. Good luck with the book.
Yep, all the best.